Hello, students. We are in Math Connections 12.3. Well, what did I assign? I assigned question 2, 4, 5, and then 10 through 12. So not a ton this time. Question 2. In the figure below, measure A is 50. Explain how to construct a 20-degree angle using this figure, an exact 20-degree angle. Okay, so you have this figure. I guess if I was to give a hint on this one, remember that we can build an equilateral triangle. Equilateral triangle has 60-degree angles. If we have a 60-degree angle and we create an angle bisector, guess what we now have? We now have a 30-degree angle. If you have a 30-degree angle, you could copy the 30-degree angle in here and say, hey, this one's 30, and you know the big one was 50, that might give you a question as to how much is left behind. Okay. A good question, though. So if you know something, think about the things you can make. You can make a 90. You can make a 60. You can make a 30. And that brings up a good point. Like if you know you have a 50, guess what else you could do? You could draw a perpendicular right here, make a nice 90-degree angle. Of course, that leaves you with a 50. And up here, a 40-degree angle. And if you have a 40-degree angle, how could you build a 20 if you know you have a 40? And don't forget, this section was talking about angle bisectors. Okay, dokie. There's number 2. Then we've got 4 through 5. Okay, 4 and 5. Place 3 dots on a piece of paper. Show how to find the location to build an airport that's the same distance from each of the cities. All right. This is one that we've now done a couple times. But that's it. How would you do it? Lines L and M intersect as shown to form 2 vertical angles. Lines P and Q bisect the vertical angles. Okay. Explain why P and Q are perpendicular. So this one, I think the biggest piece, I think, is trying to keep everything straight. L and M intersect. Okay, that's these two. So that's kind of the black lines. Then P and Q bisect the vertical angles. Okay. Well, remember, it's bisected. So whenever you see something bisected, write it down. This one bisects the vertical angles. So all of these angles right here are the same. And likewise, if I change color, I'd say every angle here, these two are the same as those two. The question is, why are P and Q vertical angles? Perpendicular. P and Q are lines. Why are they perpendicular? So you need to verify to me, you need to show me that right here, that makes a 90-degree angle. And you certainly can do it. Think about how, if you started from P and went all the way around, how much did you use? How many shapes? What different shapes? How many of them? And see if you can get down to verifying that this kind of green and that red one of each of those makes 90 degrees. That's your goal. Okay, let's jump to the next section, which I think was 10 through 12. And 10 through 12, yep, 10 through 12. Okay, a student asked if a line can be bisected. How do you respond? Can a line, be very careful, this does not say a segment. Can a line be bisected? In the figure below, a student claims that GD is congruent to GF. Is she correct? Okay. And it looks like, if you take a look, it looks like GA, that angle right there, that's an angle bisector. The GC is an angle bisector, and GE is an angle bisector. So G is definitely on the G is definitely on the angle bisector, the intersection of all of those. And she claims that GD, that's this one right here, this piece is the same as GF in terms of lengths. Is she correct? And by the way, if she is correct, you need to be able to guarantee why she is correct. Okay, need a reason for it. And lastly, number 12, the student wants to know if you can bisect any given angle with only an unmarked ruler. Could you do it with only an unmarked ruler? Huh, I that's a good question. I'll let you I'll let you try to figure that out. If you can, just remember what's nice about a ruler is the distance between the sides is the same, so it creates parallel lines. That's my hint. If all you have is an unmarked ruler, just basically a piece of wood that is the same length, could you create the angle? Could you cut that angle in half? Right. And let's take a look. Anything else that I might do? Oh, look at this quadrilaterals. Can you conclude they are congruent? So let's hear side, angle, side, angle, side. Oh, gotta love that. So yeah, anyway, there you go. Oh, hey, look up here in question 6. This is like a piece of tape. Given an angle and a roll of tape, how can you construct the bisector of the angle? Oh, look at that. Yeah, this is a hint for the one with the ruler. Question 12. Hint with question 12 is to look up here at question 7. That might help. All right, that wraps it up for chapter 12. If you have questions, let me know. I can meet with you in Zoom, on campus, in person, before or after class. Just let me know how I can support you. All right, off you go.